Sarah Chen stood in the busy airport terminal, her Air Force Service uniform crisp, despite the long journey from her deployment in the Middle East. The fluorescent lights reflected off her polished captain's bars as she wheeled her standard-issue black suitcase toward Gate B7. After 6 months of leading critical missions overseas, she was finally heading home to surprise her parents in Boston. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their destinations. Children clutched stuffed animals while their parents juggled passports and boarding passes. Business travelers in suits tapped away on their laptops, and college students with oversized headphones slouched in the waiting area chairs. Sarah checked her economy class ticket one more time, Flight 247, scheduled for a 7:30 p.m. departure. Her original flight had been cancelled due to mechanical issues, and the airline had rebooked her on this one. The gate agent had apologized profusely for not having any military seats available on such short notice. "It's perfectly fine," Sarah had assured her with a tired smile. After spending months coordinating complex aerial operations and managing a team of 30 personnel, a simple flight home in economy class was the least of her concerns. She just wanted to see her family and sleep in her own bed. As she waited for boarding to begin, Sarah noticed a commotion near the gate counter. A tall man in an expensive charcoal suit was gesturing animatedly at the gate agents, his voice carrying across the terminal. "Do you know who I am? I'm James Morton, Senior Vice President at Sterling Communications. I demand an upgrade to first class." The gate agents maintained their professional composure, explaining that first class was fully booked. Sarah observed how they handled the situation with patience, reminded of her own experiences managing difficult personalities in high-pressure situations. When boarding finally began, Sarah waited quietly in Zone 4. She watched as Morton strutted past in Zone 1, shooting dismissive glances at the economy passengers. Two flight attendants at the aircraft door greeted everyone with warm smiles, though Sarah noticed them exchange knowing looks as Morton passed. As Sarah approached the door, the senior flight attendant, whose name tag read Maria, did a double take at her uniform. "Captain Chen," she asked quietly, checking her manifest. "We actually have an open seat in first class due to a last-minute cancellation. As part of our military appreciation program, we'd love to upgrade you." Sarah began to protest, not wanting to cause any trouble, but Maria insisted. "Please, it's our pleasure. Thank you for your service." She quickly printed a new boarding pass and handed it to Sarah with a genuine smile. Walking down the aisle toward first class, Sarah kept her head high despite feeling Morton's sharp gaze following her movement. She could hear him shuffling in his seat, muttering under his breath as she approached row 2. Just as she began storing her carry-on in the overhead compartment, Morton's voice cut through the ambient noise of boarding. "Excuse me," he said loudly, his tone dripping with disdain. "I thought first class was full. That's what they told me at the gate when I tried to get my colleague upgraded." Maria, who had followed Sarah to assist with her bag, turned toward Morton with a professional smile. "Sir, we had a last-minute cancellation, and as part of our airline's policy. So you're giving it to someone who probably got a free military ticket anyway?" Morton interrupted, his face reddening. "I paid $3,000 for my seat. This is absolutely ridiculous." Several passengers paused their boarding to watch the scene unfold. Sarah remained silent, her military training kicking in as she maintained her composure. She'd faced far worse than an entitled businessman during her career. A young woman in row 4 had already pulled out her phone, recording the interaction. Other passengers began whispering among themselves, many shooting disapproving looks in Morton's direction. Sarah could feel the tension building in the cabin, but she simply took her seat with quiet dignity, remembering her commander's words about leading by example. Little did Morton know that his outburst was about to trigger a chain of events that would change his life forever, and not in the way he might have hoped. As the remaining passengers filed past first class, many of them offering Sarah subtle nods of support, the stage was set for a confrontation that would soon go viral and teach Morton a lesson he'd never forget. Here's part 2 of the story in approximately 780 words, using simple English in third person. The tension in first class continued to build as the final passengers boarded the aircraft. James Morton's face had turned an alarming shade of red as he aggressively tapped on his phone, shooting occasional glares in Sarah's direction. His expensive suit and designer watch couldn't mask his increasingly boorish behavior. This is absolutely unacceptable, Morton announced loudly to no one in particular, making sure his voice carried. I've been flying first class for 15 years, and I've never seen anything so ridiculous. They're just giving away seats now. A businessman across the aisle, wearing a similar expensive suit but carrying himself with much more dignity, lowered his newspaper and frowned at Morton. Some of us are trying to relax before takeoff, he said firmly. The man's name tag identified him as Thomas Walker, executive director. Morton seemed momentarily taken aback, but quickly recovered his bluster. Tom, I didn't see you there. Can you believe this? We pay premium prices, and are just letting anyone sit up here now. He gestured dismissively toward Sarah, who remained composed while organizing her small carry-on bag. Thomas Walker's expression hardened. James, that anyone is wearing the uniform of the United States Air Force, show some respect. Respect? Morton scoffed, his voice getting louder. I respect paying customers who earn their seats, not people who get handouts because they wear a costume. The first-class cabin went completely silent. Sarah finally turned to face Morton, her expression calm but stern. Sir, this costume represents years of service to our country. I'd be happy to tell you about the real work we do, if you're interested in learning. Morton sneered. Oh, please, I work for a living. I don't need lectures from. Mr. Morton. Maria, the flight attendant, interrupted smoothly. I need to remind you that disruptive behavior can result in removal from the flight. Would you like me to call the captain to discuss this further? Several phones were now pointed in their direction, recording Morton's behavior. A young woman in business class mouthed, I'm so sorry, to Sarah, while continuing to document the scene. Are you threatening me? Morton demanded, standing up partially before the seatbelt sign dinged on. Do you know how much business my company does with this airline? Another flight attendant approached with a satellite phone. Sir, we've received a call from your office. They'd like to speak with you immediately. Morton's face went from red to pale. What? That's impossible. How could they? It seems someone posted a video of your comments on social media, the flight attendant explained quietly. It's already gaining attention. Thomas Walker held up his phone. James, you're trending. Not in a good way. Hashtag First Class Jerk is picking up steam, and someone identified you as a VP at Sterling Communications. Morton grabbed the satellite phone, his hands shaking slightly. He listened for a moment, his expression growing increasingly concerned. Sir, I can explain. No, I didn't mean. Yes, I understand the company's position on diversity, and, yes, sir, I understand. Meanwhile, other passengers had begun sharing their own positive experiences with military personnel. An elderly woman leaned forward from her business class seat and touched Sarah's shoulder gently. My grandson serves in the Air Force too, she said warmly. Thank you for everything you do. Some people, she glanced pointedly at Morton, weren't raised right. Sarah smiled graciously. Thank you, ma'am. Please thank your grandson for his service. As the plane began to taxi, Morton sat in silent shock, staring at his phone as messages and notifications poured in. The video of his outburst had already been shared thousands of times, with comments condemning his behavior and praising Sarah's professional response. Thomas Walker leaned across the aisle toward Sarah. Captain, I serve on the board of several veteran support organizations. Your composure under this unfortunate situation is commendable. Here's my card. We'd love to have you speak at our next event. As the plane accelerated down the runway, Morton slumped in his seat, his earlier arrogance deflated. He was beginning to realize that his impulsive outburst wasn't just going to ruin his flight. It might very well ruin his career. And this was only the beginning of his problems, as the video continued to spread across social media platforms like wildfire. 30 minutes into the flight, the situation in first class had evolved from uncomfortable to unbearable. James Morton sat rigidly in his seat, frantically scrolling through his phone as notifications continued to pour in. The video of his outburst had now reached over 1 million views across various social media platforms, and the comments were ruthless. Maria, the senior flight attendant, approached with the drink cart. Would anyone like a beverage? She asked, deliberately starting with Sarah. Captain Chen, what may I get for you? Just water, please, Sarah replied politely. She had pulled out some military reports to review during the flight, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the tension around her. When Maria reached Morton, he barely looked up from his phone. His hands were trembling as he read an email from Sterling Communications Board of Directors. The subject line read, URGENT, Emergency Board Meeting regarding recent incident. Sir, would you like a drink? Maria asked again. Morton finally glanced up, his former arrogance replaced by visible anxiety. Double scotch, he muttered. Make it quick. Thomas Walker, the executive director seated across the aisle, was on his own phone, speaking quietly but intensely. Yes, I witnessed the whole thing. No, it was completely unprovoked. The Air Force captain has been nothing but professional. Yes, I'd be willing to make a statement. A young woman in business class raised her hand to get Maria's attention. Excuse me, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. I'm a reporter for the Boston Globe. Would Captain Chen be willing to comment on the incident? Before Sarah could respond, another passenger spoke up. Hey, I recognize you, Captain Chen. Weren't you part of that rescue mission in the Pacific last year? The one that saved those cargo ship crews during the typhoon? Sarah nodded modestly. Yes, I was one of many service members involved in that operation. The revelation spread quickly through the cabin. Passengers began pulling up news articles about the rescue mission on their phones, sharing them with their seatmates. Morton sank lower in his seat as he overheard the murmured conversations about Sarah's accomplishments. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his biggest client. Saw the video. Meeting tomorrow to discuss our contract with Sterling Communications. This is unacceptable. Morton loosened his expensive silk tie, feeling like it was choking him. He tried to catch Sarah's eye, perhaps to attempt an apology, but she remained focused on her work, deliberately giving him no opportunity to engage. A flight attendant approached Morton with another satellite phone. Sir, your office is calling again. They say it's urgent. Morton grabbed the phone and hurried to the small first-class bathroom, locking himself inside. The other passengers could hear his muffled voice, alternating between pleading and arguing. Meanwhile, Thomas Walker had moved to the empty seat next to Sarah. Captain Chen, he said quietly, I'm not just an executive director. I'm also on the board of Sterling Communications, though Morton doesn't know that. I was traveling incognito to observe our regional offices. Sarah looked up from her reports, surprised by this revelation. What you're watching, Walker continued, is the self-destruction of a man who's been causing problems for years. We've had complaints about his behavior before, but never such clear evidence. Sometimes people create their own consequences. The bathroom door opened, and Morton emerged, looking pale and shaken. He had removed his suit jacket, and his crisp white shirt was wrinkled and damp with stress-induced sweat. As he walked back to his seat, his phone dinged with another notification. His company's stock price had dropped 3% after #FirstClassShirk started trending. Several rows back, a group of veterans who had seen the viral video had begun sharing their own stories of service, creating an impromptu support network for Sarah. Their quiet conversations about duty, sacrifice, and respect carried forward to first class, each word seeming to weigh heavily on Morton's conscience. As the flight continued over the darkening landscape below, Morton's world continued to unravel through buzzing phones and whispered conversations. He had started this flight as a proud executive throwing his weight around. Now, 3 hours remained before landing, and his reputation was in free fall. Little did he know, the worst was yet to come, as the story was about to take an even more dramatic turn. The flight reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs turned off with a gentle ding. Throughout the cabin, passengers were still buzzing about the incident, many of them watching and rewatching the viral video of Morton's outburst. But a new development was about to unfold. A middle-aged man in business class suddenly stood up, his face lighting up with recognition. Wait a minute, he called out, loud enough for the first-class cabin to hear. Captain Chen, Sarah Chen, my son was on that cargo ship. The man made his way forward, ignoring the flight attendant's gentle reminder to return to his seat. He stopped at Sarah's row, tears forming in his eyes. My son Michael was on the Golden Star when the typhoon hit. You were the pilot who spotted their life rafts. Sarah smiled warmly, remembering that harrowing night. Sir, I was just doing my job. Your son and his crew showed incredible courage during those 12 hours. Doing your job? The man's voice cracked with emotion. You flew through a typhoon in near-zero visibility. The whole crew said they'd given up hope until they saw your aircraft's lights. He turned to address the other passengers. This officer right here led the rescue mission that saved 27 lives, including my son's. Morton, who had been pretending to work on his laptop, couldn't help but listen. Each word about Sarah's heroism seemed to sink him further into his seat. Maria, the flight attendant, had tears in her eyes. Captain, we had no idea. Why didn't you say something when Mr. Morton was? It's not why I serve, Sarah replied simply. Every member of our military has similar stories. We don't do it for recognition. The father of the rescued sailor wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photo of a newborn baby. This is Michael's daughter, born 2 months ago. He named her Sarah. His voice broke again. If it wasn't for you, my son wouldn't be alive to be a father. The entire first-class cabin had gone silent. Even the most jaded travelers were moved by this unexpected reunion. Thomas Walker, the undercover board member, was quietly recording everything on his phone. Morton's face had turned an ashen gray. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. No, you didn't, Thomas Walker responded firmly. You didn't bother to know anything about Captain Chen before you decided to humiliate her. Just like you never bothered to know anything about the employees you berate at our company. Morton's head snapped up. Our company? What do you mean? Walker smiled coldly. Board of Directors, Sterling Communications. I was traveling incognito to evaluate our regional management. I'd say this trip has been very informative. The color drained completely from Morton's face as he realized the full implications of his actions. Not only had he publicly attacked a military hero, but he'd done it in front of a board member of his own company. More passengers were sharing the story on social media now, adding the details about Sarah's rescue mission to the original viral video. Hashtag Captain Chen started trending alongside hashtag FirstClassJerk, creating a stark contrast between true leadership and Morton's behavior. Sarah, meanwhile, had taken out a small notepad and was writing something. She handed it to the emotional father. Please give this to Michael and his family. It's my personal email. I'd love to meet little Sarah someday. The father hugged her, not caring about protocol or proper airplane etiquette. Other passengers wiped away tears, moved by the genuine moment of human connection. Morton stared out the window, his world crumbling around him. His phone had stopped buzzing, a silence that seemed more ominous than the constant notifications. The board meeting scheduled for tomorrow now loomed like an execution date for his career. As the father returned to his seat, still wiping his eyes, the contrast between the two first-class passengers couldn't have been starker. In one seat sat Sarah Chen, who had risked her life to save others and sought no recognition for it. In the other sat James Morton, whose carefully constructed image of success had been shattered by 10 minutes of showing his true character. The flight was only halfway to its destination, but for Morton, it felt like the longest journey of his life. And somewhere in the darkening sky, karma was preparing its final act. As the flight continued through the night sky, the atmosphere in first class shifted dramatically when an elderly gentleman in an Air Force veteran's cap made his way forward from economy class. He moved slowly, supported by his cane, but his eyes were sharp and focused on Sarah. Pardon me, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military service. I couldn't help but overhear about Captain Chen. I think there's something else everyone should know. Maria, the flight attendant, started to direct him back to his seat, but Sarah stood up. Colonel Thompson, she asked in surprise, immediately recognizing the retired officer. I had no idea you were on this flight, sir. The elderly officer smiled. At ease, Captain. I was actually heading to a military ceremony where you were supposed to be honored. He turned to address the cabin. You see, Captain Chen here wasn't just any pilot during that typhoon rescue. She was specifically ordered not to fly that night. Morton, who had been pretending to sleep, opened his eyes slightly, unable to help listening. Colonel Thompson continued. The conditions were deemed too dangerous, but Captain Chen knew those sailors wouldn't survive another hour in those waters. She volunteered anyway, knowing it could end her career or her life. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, not used to being the center of attention. Sir, please. The military was going to release this story next week, but given tonight's events, he pulled out a formal-looking document from his briefcase. Captain Chen is being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions that night. She's the first female pilot in her squadron's history to receive this honor. The news rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had been following the drama immediately began sharing this new information on social media. #Heroine First Class started trending within minutes. Thomas Walker, the Sterling Communications board member, looked directly at Morton. "Well, James, still think she doesn't deserve that seat." Morton loosened his tie further, looking physically ill. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Sterling Communications executive under fire for harassing decorated military officer. The story had been picked up by major news networks. A young girl, about 8 years old, shyly approached Sarah's seat with a piece of paper and pen. Could you sign this for me? I want to be a pilot like you when I grow up." Sarah smiled warmly, taking the paper. "What's your name?" "Emily," the girl replied. "My mom says you're a real hero, not like people who just think they're important because they have money." She glanced pointedly at Morton, displaying the brutal honesty only children can get away with. The cabin erupted in poorly concealed laughter. Morton's face flushed deep red again, but this time from shame rather than anger. Colonel Thompson wasn't finished. "There's more." The reason Captain Chen was flying economy today. She gave up her military-arranged business class seat to a junior enlisted soldier who was rushing home to see his dying mother. Maria, who had been serving drinks, nearly dropped her tray. "Is that true, Captain?" Sarah nodded slightly. "You needed it more than I did." The colonel placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "This is what real leadership looks like, folks. Not throwing your weight around because you think you're important, but quietly doing the right thing when no one's watching." Morton suddenly stood up, mumbling something about needing the bathroom. As he hurried down the aisle, passengers pulled back as if his very presence was toxic. Thomas Walker took out his phone and made a brief call. "Yes, emergency board meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. Yes, I've seen everything firsthand. No, there won't be any need for his side of the story." Sarah tried to steer the conversation away from herself, asking Colonel Thompson about his family and current projects. But the story of her quiet heroism had already taken on a life of its own. Passengers throughout the plane were sharing it on every social platform available. As Morton returned to his seat, he found himself in a peculiar form of social exile. No one would make eye contact with him. Flight attendants served him with cold professionalism. He had started this flight believing himself to be the most important person in first class. Now he was realizing that true importance isn't something you can buy with a first-class ticket. It's earned through character and sacrifice. 2 hours remained in the flight when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I've just been informed that we have a very special passenger aboard. Captain Sarah Chen, would you please identify yourself to the cabin crew?" Sarah reluctantly raised her hand as Maria stood nearby, beaming. "Captain Chen," the pilot continued, "I served with your father 20 years ago. Colonel David Chen was one of the finest officers I've ever known. When I heard what happened in first class today, I made a few calls. There's a surprise waiting for you at the gate." Morton, who had been sitting in miserable silence, perked up slightly. Ground-based media had caught wind of the story, and his phone showed dozens of missed calls from reporters. The hashtags about the incident had reached global trending status. A young flight attendant hurried up to first class and whispered something to Maria, who immediately turned to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just received word that several news crews are waiting at our arrival gate. Also," she paused, glancing at Morton, "airport police have been requested by Sterling Communications to escort Mr. Morton to a private exit." Thomas Walker nodded grimly. "The board has decided to take immediate action. We can't have someone representing our company who shows such poor judgment." Morton finally broke his silence. "You can't do this to me. I brought in millions for the company. I have contacts, relationships." "Had," Walker corrected. "You had contacts. Check your email, James. Our 3 biggest clients have already contacted us to terminate their contracts. They've seen the videos. All of them." Sarah, who had been trying to stay out of the escalating situation, suddenly received a text message that made her smile. She turned to Maria. Would it be possible to make an announcement? My parents are among the people waiting at the gate. I wasn't supposed to be home for another week. Maria happily took to the intercom, sharing the news that Sarah's homecoming would be even more special than planned. The cabin erupted in applause. Morton slumped further in his seat, the contrast between his situation and Sarah's becoming painfully clear. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his wife. How could you embarrass our family like this? It's all over the internet. The children's schools have called. Meanwhile, passengers had formed a line to shake Sarah's hand. Each one had a story, someone they knew in the military, a family member who had served, or simply wanting to express their gratitude. Sarah greeted each person with genuine warmth, deflecting praise and instead asking about their own lives and families. Thomas Walker observed the scene with satisfaction. You know, James, he said quietly, in all my years on the board, I've never seen someone destroy their career so thoroughly in such a short time. But then again, I've never seen someone so clearly deserve it. A businessman from economy class approached Sarah with a business card. Captain, I run a speaking circuit for corporate leadership training. We'd love to have you share your story about real leadership versus, well, he glanced at Morton meaningfully. As the flight began its initial descent, the contrast in futures facing the two first-class passengers couldn't have been starker. Sarah was heading toward a hero's welcome, surrounded by respect and new opportunities. Morton was facing professional exile, public shame, and a long walk through a private terminal exit. Maria made one final pass through the cabin, preparing for landing. She stopped at Morton's seat. Sir, she said with professional courtesy, the ground team has asked that you remain seated after landing until other passengers have deplaned. It's for your own privacy. Morton nodded numbly, finally understanding the full magnitude of his actions. Through the window, he could see the lights of the approaching airport, where reporters and cameras waited to document his downfall. Sarah tucked away her belongings neatly, preparing for landing. Despite all the attention, she maintained the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout the flight. As the plane descended through the clouds, she thought about seeing her parents, about the unexpected recognition of her service, and about how a simple airline upgrade had triggered such an extraordinary chain of events. The cabin crew announced their final descent, and as the plane banked toward the runway, Karma was preparing its final act in the terminal below. The aircraft touched down smoothly at Boston Logan International Airport, its landing lights cutting through the evening darkness. Inside the terminal, an unexpected crowd had gathered near Gate B-17. News cameras were set up, their bright lights illuminating a group of uniformed military personnel, Sarah's parents, and a crowd of civilians holding welcome signs. As the plane taxied to the gate, the pilot made one final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until we've come to a complete stop. Also, there was a pause. Mr. Morton, airport security has requested you exit through the rear door after other passengers have deplaned. Morton's professional disgrace was now complete. Through the plane's window, he could see the flashing lights of news vans and the gathering crowd. His phone had stopped buzzing. His company had already suspended his email account and phone service. The seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Instead of the usual rush to exit, something extraordinary happened. The entire cabin waited, allowing Sarah to exit first. As she stood, a spontaneous applause broke out. "Thank you for your service, Captain," a businessman called out. "You're a real hero," added another passenger. Sarah walked down the aisle with dignity, nodding graciously to the passengers. As she emerged from the jet bridge, she was immediately enveloped in her parents' embrace. Her father, himself a retired Air Force colonel, had tears in his eyes as he hugged his daughter. Behind them, news reporters began their live broadcasts. "We're here at Logan Airport, where social media sensation hashtag First Class Jerk has transformed into an inspiring story of military heroism." Thomas Walker, the Sterling Communications board member, exited next. He walked directly to a group of stern-looking executives waiting by the gate. "Emergency board meeting starts in 30 minutes, he announced. "Though I think we all know how this vote will go." Meanwhile, Morton remained in his seat, watching his world crumble through the airplane window. The crowd at the gate had grown larger. Someone had printed screenshots from the viral video and was holding them up like protest signs. A police officer boarded the plane. "Mr. Morton, please come with me. We'll escort you through a private exit to avoid any incidents. As Morton stood to leave, Maria, the flight attendant, stopped him. Sir, you left something in your seat pocket. She handed him a magazine, the airline's in-flight publication. On the cover was an article about the airline's military appreciation program, featuring photos of service members being upgraded to first class. Morton took one last look at the scene through the window. Sarah was now surrounded by fellow officers, her parents beaming proudly beside her. News cameras captured every moment. The story had evolved far beyond a viral video. It had become a national conversation about respect, service, and the consequences of arrogance. As he was led through the empty back half of the plane, Morton heard his name mentioned in one of the news broadcasts filtering through the cabin. Sterling Communications stock has dropped 12% in after-hours trading following the viral video. The police escort guided him through a service door and down a maintenance stairway. It was a humbling exit for a man who, just hours ago, had been bragging about his first-class status. Back at the gate, Sarah was handling the attention with characteristic grace. The real heroes, she told a reporter, are the men and women who serve without recognition every day. I'm just fortunate to wear the same uniform they do. Colonel Thompson, who had witnessed everything from the beginning, stood with Sarah's parents. You know, he said to them, some people spend their whole lives trying to prove they're important. Others, like your daughter, just quietly go about the business of actually being important. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah's story was already spreading beyond the viral video. News outlets were picking up the details about her rescue mission, her distinguished flying cross, and her habit of quiet sacrifice. The incident with Morton had unexpectedly shone a light on the kind of leadership that really matters. Meanwhile, in a private airport security office, Morton sat alone, waiting for his car service to arrive. His phone, now using airport Wi-Fi, showed one final notification. Sterling Communications announces immediate leadership changes. The article already had his replacement's name. The day was ending, but the story was far from over. Sarah's active composure in the face of arrogance had sparked a national moment of reflection about privilege, respect, and true heroism. 1 week after the infamous flight, the consequences of that fateful day had fully unfolded. Sarah Chen sat in her parents' living room, watching as yet another news channel replayed the viral video, which had now reached over 50 million views across various platforms. And in corporate news, the anchor announced, Sterling Communications has officially terminated James Morton's employment following his widely publicized confrontation with Air Force Captain Sarah Chen. The company's new diversity and inclusion program, named First Class Respect, will be launched next month. Sarah's mother turned off the TV and handed her daughter a cup of tea. I still can't believe how many people have reached out to you, she said, gesturing to the pile of letters and cards that had arrived from around the country. The incident had taken on a life of its own. Veterans groups had rallied around Sarah's story, using it to highlight the ongoing contributions of military personnel. Several major airlines had strengthened their military appreciation programs, and a nationwide conversation about privilege and respect had emerged. Morton's fall from grace had been swift and complete. Beyond losing his job, he'd become the subject of countless memes and social media jokes. His former clients had publicly distanced themselves, and his country club membership had been quietly revoked. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Thomas Walker. Captain Chen, the board would like to thank you again for your grace under pressure. We've established a scholarship fund in your name for veterans entering corporate leadership. Would you consider serving on the advisory committee? Before she could reply, another message arrived, this time from Maria, the flight attendant. You'll never guess who I had on my flight today. James Morton, flying economy to a job interview in Chicago. He asked me to pass along his apology. I think he finally learned his lesson. Sarah smiled softly and set down her phone. She had never wanted Morton to suffer. She had only hoped he would learn from the experience. Mom, she said, I think it's time we move on from this story. There are more important things to focus on. As if on cue, Colonel Thompson's email arrived with details about the upcoming Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony. The military had decided to make it a public event, using the opportunity to highlight the contributions of female service members. The doorbell rang. Sarah's father opened it to find Emily, the 8-year-old girl from the flight, standing there with her mother. Emily clutched a model airplane and a women's aviation magazine featuring Sarah on the cover. Captain Chen, Emily said shyly, I joined the Young Aviators Club at school. Would you? Would you come speak to us about being a pilot? Sarah knelt down to Emily's level. I'd be honored. You know, when I was your age, someone inspired me to fly too. Later that evening, as Sarah prepared to return to her unit, she reflected on how a simple airline upgrade had sparked such widespread change. Sterling Communications had transformed its corporate culture. Airlines had strengthened their military appreciation programs. Most importantly, people like Emily were being inspired to pursue their dreams. Her father helped her pack her bags for the return to Duvy. You know, he said, sometimes the biggest lessons come from the smallest moments. Morton learned about humility. Others learned about respect, and some, he smiled at the stack of letters from young girls wanting to become pilots, learned about possibilities. Sarah checked her watch. Time to head to the airport. This time, she had a proper military flight booked, but she wouldn't have minded flying economy. After all, it was never about where you sat on the plane. It was about how you conducted yourself in any situation. As she drove to the airport, a final news alert popped up on her phone. James Morton announces new initiative to support veteran employment. Perhaps the biggest transformation had been in Morton himself. Sarah smiled as she pulled into the airport parking lot. The story that had begun with conflict had ended with understanding. Morton had learned about humility, the public had been reminded about service and sacrifice, and a new generation had been inspired. Walking through the terminal in her uniform, Sarah received several respectful nods from other travelers. She wasn't looking for recognition, she never had. But she was grateful that something positive had come from that difficult moment in first class. As she boarded her flight home, Sarah thought about Emily and all the other young people who had been inspired by this story. Sometimes, the best way to lead was simply to show others how to behave with dignity, no matter where you were seated.